Good morning. The title of the sermon is, What Should I Do? Part 3. On June 7th of last year, our outdoor services began. A week and a half earlier, George Floyd's death took place in Minneapolis on Memorial Day, an event that echoed around the country and around the world. What Should I Do? Part 1 and Part 2 were the title of a 2-week series of sermons on June 7th and June 14th, which happened to be our first 2 outdoor services. The sermon addressed the question, how do I respond faithfully to this horrific event? Those 2 sermons focus not on one image, but on 3. The first image, or the catalytic image, is that of an African-American man, George Floyd, in handcuffs on the ground and saying over and over again, "I can't breathe," while a white police officer has his knee on Floyd's neck and 3 other police officers do not intervene. This continues in that video for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. To that first image, there was almost universal condemnation from President Trump, from persons of every race, every political stripe, including the vast, vast majority of police officers. That was the first image. The second image was the response of hundreds of thousands, even millions of people protesting peacefully throughout the country and even beyond. The third image was of looting and vandalizing that also took place by a smaller group of people, but took place nonetheless. Those were the 3 images that we were seeking to respond to. For some strange reason, the second sermon in that series emerged as the most watched worship service over the last year, with the exception of our Christmas Eve service, which of course involved kids and a stable and lots of wonderful music. But this sermon, the regular Sunday sermon series, on June 14th, drew roughly 100 people present on the grass or in their cars, but there was nearly 350 additional views of that service, counting both the sermon only and the live stream. That's almost double our regular viewership. Evidently, the question, how do I respond, part 2, resonated deeply for many of us. On Tuesday of this last week, the verdict was reached by the jury of the Derek Chauvin murder trial. A jury of 12 ordinary people, carefully looking at all the evidence presented by both the prosecution and the defense, and those 12 people unanimously agreed Derek Chauvin was guilty on all 3 counts, including second-degree murder. This event forms the bookend to what our system of justice now has judged the murder of George Floyd. Just as those 2 sermons seemed timely and relevant last June, this bookend sermon, adding to those 3 images a 4th image, the verdict of murder, seems relevant, at least to me. What do I do? Part 3 is an important question. I suspect that our children and grandchildren will ask us how we responded. How should I respond? Part 2, that sermon that was preached on the 14th of June, was based on Micah 6:8, which is part of today's call to worship. What does the Lord require of me? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with my God. But we added to that, for today, our main scripture, the parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke 10. In the movie Avatar, the traditional greeting among the Na'vi people that live on the planet Pandora is to look deeply in the eyes of the person they are greeting and say to each other, "I see you. I see you." And the other person responds, "I see you." The movie is in essence about how, at first, the Na'vi were not really seen by the visiting earthlings as people at all, and vice versa. They were simply a problem to be solved by genocide. But the change happens when a Marine named Jake actually sees the Navi people as people, saying with integrity, I see you. The parable of the Good Samaritan is in essence Jesus telling a story about a Jewish man who was robbed and beaten and left for dead. A priest and a Levite both pass by because they don't really see the man. They only see a problem to be avoided. Yet the Samaritan, and Samaritans were natural enemies to the Jews, the Samaritan comes upon the man, and then it says, when he saw him, really saw him, not as a problem, but as a human being in need. When he saw him, he responds with extraordinary love, compassion, generosity, and faithfulness. I would argue that at the heart of the parable of the Good Samaritan is the power of seeing another person, really seeing them, not as a thing, not as a problem, not as a stereotype, but as a fellow human being. Once the Samaritan sees the man, everything sort of naturally happens. The key is in the seeing. Seeing invokes a faithful response. Non-seeing results in a non-faithful reaction. Reactionary responses have another name in the scriptures. We call them sin. I want to tap into our most watched Sunday worship service back on June 14th last year. That sermon entitled, How Should I Respond, Part 2. In that sermon, I share two personal stories. We'll pick it up on the other side. What should I do in response to what is happening in our country right now? Last week's sermon focused on those three images that are embedded in our consciousness. The first image of a black man dying with the knee of a police officer on his neck. The second image of thousands of people marching for justice. The third image of looting and violence. And Jesus challenges us to not just grab, hold, or fixate on just one image and ignore the others. This is clear in the way Jesus calls for justice, but it's a very unique understanding of justice, one rooted in not hating and not demonizing those on the other side, but rather the ones that I am most uncomfortable with, to love them. And this is the only means that holds the possibility of transforming them and transforming us, and thus transforming the world and building what Jesus refers to as the kingdom of God. But this is not an easy process. I can't emphasize how hard it is to resist the tendency to quickly react. Reacting rarely holds the inward and the outward together. Reacting generally requires just focusing on one of those three images and rejecting the other. Reacting generally is based on some form of demonizing or hating, which is in a direct rejection of Jesus' teaching that we are to love our enemy. I want to close with two personal stories. One comes from the past, the other took place this last week. First, the one from the past. In 1994, our son Tadessa arrived from Ethiopia at 2.5 years of age, brought to us by a missionary couple from Ethiopia. And we picked him up at the San Francisco airport. We were living in Wairika, and my folks were living in Alameda, and so we spent about a day and a half with my folks so that they would have some bonding time with their newest grandchild. We had a wonderful time. And the next day, my mom and I, we were walking the dog. And my folks were living in the house that my mom had spent most of her life in. It was the house she grew up in, and then I grew up in a different house. We lived about a mile away for about 20 years, but then they moved back to the house that my mom had grown up in because it was one story and they were having trouble with steps. So they moved back into the house. Now, the house is on a little street in Alameda called Christ Street. Sounds like Christ, but it's Christ. It's kind of a famous or maybe infamous street because it's only 1 block long, but on the very corner is a house called the Spite House, which made it into Ripley's Believe It or Not, but that's another sermon. Colorful story behind that. But anyway, this one little block of Christ Street, there's 12 houses. And my mom grew up knowing in her house and the other 11 families, she knew every single family. And as we were walking the dog, she still knew every single family that lived on that block. And not only did she know them, but she had been in every single house on that block and vice versa. They had been in her house. I mean, it was a really tight-knit neighborhood. She knew them all, and they all knew her. And as we were walking, she stopped and she kind of welled up with emotion. And she said, I've never told you this, but there is an unspoken agreement among the 12 families that live on Chris Street. And it's known absolutely clear that if anyone was to sell their house or to rent out their house, they would not do it to a black family or a Mexican family. And she said, and because of that, when your grandmother died and we had to rent out the house, we didn't advertise in the newspaper. We advertised by word of mouth because she said, I was deathly afraid that if we advertised in the newspaper that a fully qualified, wonderful black family or Mexican family would apply for the house and I wouldn't know what to do. And I wouldn't be able to stand up to those families that I knew so well. And she said, now as I look at my grandson, I realize how wrong this is. Well, that was 1994. In 1999, my folks moved up to Wairika. And my mom rented out the house. My mom and dad rented out the house, and they put it in the newspaper, and they rented it to a wonderful family of color. And so that turbulent, that struggle that had begun back in 1994, 5 years earlier, had borne some fruit. The other story took place this last week. I mentioned that, I've been churning and struggling on how to respond. I shared last week how, holding together those images for me led me to go up in the mornings and scrub graffiti and get to know the store owners that had been looted and vandalized in Sacramento. But this week, something different emerged. And again, wrestling, not knowing exactly how to respond, and in those places where you don't know how to respond, and you kind of try to hold things together and figure out where the Spirit's moving. And what seemed to come to me was I felt the need to reach out to my family and my friends that are in law enforcement. And I have a lot of family and friends in law enforcement. And in the midst of this time, I just sensed that there was an intensity, there were lots of strong feelings, and I needed to talk with them, I needed to listen to them, I needed to love them. And so I called them up. And most of you know I do my caulking on the phone while I walk. I had way over 20,000 steps per day this week because they were long conversations, every single one of them. And I began by just wanting to know how they were doing. And everyone without exception was really hurting, really, really bad. Sometimes they would talk for 45 minutes straight, just how hurt they were, how angry they were. They felt maligned. They felt judged and condemned. They felt blanket condemnation. And a number of them said, these 4 officers did something that I would never, ever, ever do. And what they did was wrong, but this blanket condemnation is it's unbelievably painful. And some of them, that's where they are. That's where the conversation ended. I listened to them, and for the most part, that's where they are right now. They're angry and they're hurt. But some went on to share, but saying, there's some things that are really wrong. One described, it's really well known that people aren't treated the same. And it's not always based on color. A lot of times it's based on different things, but there is not equal treatment. And everybody knows that. And they're wrestling with what to do about that. I then asked them, what would you do to make it better? What could you do? You know how often it is, we think, oh my, if I was in charge, I could take care of this in 5 minutes, right? Not one of them knew what to do. Not one of them. They all said, I don't know. It's so hard. It's so hard. There aren't easy, quick solutions. I don't know. Now, the last thing that happened was they sort of turned to me and they all assumed that because of Tedessa, because I had an African-American son, that somehow I saw this in a particular way, that there was just one particular way because of that reality in my life, that's the way it would be. And they were surprised when that wasn't true. Yeah, it doesn't quite work that way. So I've committed to continue to be in conversation with them, that those calls are not over. I'm going to continue to call. I'm going to continue to reach out. I'm going to continue to listen. I'm going to continue to love. So what does the Lord require of you and me right now, all of us? But to do justice. Yes, to do justice. There is no opting out. It is not an either or. To love kindness and to walk humbly with our God. I would encourage you to allow the Spirit of God some room and some time in your life right now. To not quickly assume you know exactly what is right and what is wrong. To listen to others, especially those that are most deeply affected. In the first story, my mom saw her grandson, Tedessa, and that seeing him, really seeing him for who he is, resulted in her dealing with some troubling parts of her life that for decades she had not dealt with. And through seeing him, she did indeed change. Like the Samaritan seeing the man beaten and left for dead, once the Samaritan saw him, unlike the priest and the Levite who didn't really see him except as a problem, once the Samaritan saw him, faithfulness naturally followed. That's the power of seeing. In the parable and with the example of my mom. But what about the second story? My reaching out to my law enforcement family members and friends. They were very much in the initial wounded, shocked and confused phase when I called them last June to see how they were doing. This last week, I called each of them back to ask how the fourth image, the guilty verdict, how the addition of that fourth image to the other three affected them. I was blown away by their responses. Remember, these were all persons who were deeply hurting 11 months ago. As law enforcement, they felt maligned and painted very negatively with a broad brush that seemed deeply unjust to them. But in talking with them after Tuesday's verdict, every single one of them described essentially the same response. First, they had focused deeply this past year on George Floyd, on what happened to him, on the protests that followed, and also the rioting. They took in all three images. They looked deeper than the quick reactionary judgments that were being tossed around, where people would focus on just one of the three images and ignore the others. They really saw the people involved as people. In particular, they put themselves in the shoes of the people in each image. This included putting themselves in the place of George Floyd and also putting themselves in the place of Derek Chauvin. They also put themselves in the place of the peaceful protesters, and they put themselves in the place of those who rioted. It's funny, when you actually put yourself in people's place, those simple reactionary responses just kind of drop away. And when they did all that, what was their response to the fourth image? Without exception, they were 100 in affirmation, 100 agreement with the verdict. They agreed with it entirely. They felt that the facts presented justified the unanimous agreement of the 12 jurors, those 12 regular people on all three charges. They saw, and when they saw, everything became much clearer to them. Then I asked them, what needs to happen now? There was also some consensus. There needs to be change. But they all had this humble realization that these changes will need to be carefully considered. They didn't believe there was any quick panacea. There must be better training, especially in de-escalation. There must be clear guidelines banning certain types of restraint. There must be a weeding out of law enforcement personnel that are bad actors, which, while a small percentage, they all said is not inconsequential by any means in their assessment. Seeing George Floyd, seeing Derek Chauvin, seeing those who protested, seeing those even who looted, did all that. I was blown away. The power of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan is that it may be the greatest teaching in the world on the power of seeing. And it is so powerful that it ends with Jesus simply saying, go and do likewise. Yeah, that's all it takes. When you see the power of that story, when you see the power of seeing, he simply says, go and do likewise. So what should I do? Like my law enforcement family members and friends, who I can assure you feel the weight of this especially intensely, truly look and see George Floyd as a human being, as a son, as a father, as a grandfather, as a human being crying out, I can't breathe. And truly see Derek Chauvin also as a human being. And those who took to the streets, mostly peacefully but violently for a few bad actors, truly see them also as people. For when we truly see others not as things or problems or stereotypes, but as fellow human beings, like the Good Samaritan saw the man beaten and left for dead, faithfulness sounds like this: having seen, go and do likewise. Amen.